So who's really the most vulnerable? So that is the country of tomorrow. That's the most vulnerable country. So all the world's children today are not only most vulnerable, we've gone now from vulnerability to horrifying, terrible impacts. And I think that's predictable by what we're seeing.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, your host and the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. Today, we're tackling a critical question and a simple one to ask, but a very difficult one sometimes to answer, and that is what countries are most vulnerable to climate change and what can be done to reduce their risks. We'll explore why some nations face disproportionate impacts, what global and local actions can help, and how you, our viewers, can get involved. We're using a wide variety of sources today: the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Country Index, the German Watch Climate Risk Index 2025, the Oxfam Climate Vulnerability Analysis, and the Columbia Climate School's Vulnerability Index, which identifies 65 red zone nations struggling with both climate risks and limited access to finance. Joining me are our expert panelists, as always, Dr. Peter Carter, based in British Columbia. He's a medical doctor who has been an IPCC expert reviewer, director of the Climate Emergency Institute, and has a particular interest and passion for the connections between health and climate change. And Paul Beckwith from Ottawa, you all know, is a climate system scientist with degrees in engineering and physics, and he's known for his yes to over 1,200 YouTube videos explaining climate science and extreme weather. So together we'll unpack the data and the solutions to look at who's most vulnerable and why. And afterwards, for the first time, we're going to try something new. The end of our program, we're going to, just for a few minutes, highlight quickly some of the many stories about the climate crisis and the climate emergency that have appeared in the last few weeks. So we hope you'll stay tuned to the very, very end. And with that, I'm delighted, as always, to introduce Paul. Paul, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Herb. So, of all the climate risk indices, my preference is the Columbia Climate School. They call it the Climate Finance Vulnerability Index. And what I really like is their dashboard. So, they look at 188 different countries around the world and they plot them on a scatter plot based on climate risk, and they divide it into two quadrants, the lower half, the upper half for climate risk. And then they have financial vulnerability on the x-axis, and again divided into two quadrants. So they talk about a red zone where the climate risk is highest and the financial ability of the country to prepare for climate change, for recovering once a climate disaster occurs, stability of government, things like that are all incorporated into their risk factors. So I'll just give some examples here. Most of the countries that are at highest at risk are in Africa. In fact, two-thirds of them are in Africa, and they're there not so much, the climate risks aren't so much greater there than other parts of the world, but the ability of the government to withstand climate risk, climate shocks, and extreme weather events and things like that is greatly reduced. There's already lots of inner turmoil, very unstable governments. They don't have enough money to recover from climate disasters, etc. So in the top 10 list of countries, they're pretty much all, African countries for the most part. On the other side of the coin, they talk about countries that they think are very capable of dealing with climate risks. So I'm going to talk about the number one country where you want to live if you're worried about climate change, according to this index, and that's Norway. let me call this Viking Age 2.0 because Norway, Denmark, Sweden, all of these countries are in the top 10. These countries that were world dominating during the Viking Age. So let's call it Viking Age 2.0 to deal with climate risks. So why is Norway number one? Well, let's look at some of the parameters that they look at. So they look at the financial ability of a country to recover from climate disasters. So they create these graphs with there's three vertices, a triangle. On one axis, it's debt sustainability, how much debt a country is in. They have financial integration of services is another axis, and financial sophistication. So the ability of a country to get money to put into recovery from climate disasters, for example. They weigh all these things. This is the latest and newest index. They go back to they have data typically from 2010 to present day when they come up their risk with the risk factors and every parameter that they talk about. They have a chart showing how the risk has changed to that parameter over the last 15 years. Then, so for their climate risk, a risk is basically you have a hazard, but you have to have exposure of people and regions to that hazard. So some of the parameters that they look at for Norway are, and all other countries are, I'm just giving Norway as an example, population living below 5 meters of sea level, right? That's 7.2% of Norway. They look at the risks, not just for climate, but the risks of earthquake, river flooding, which is high for Norway, tsunamis, tropical cyclones, coastal flooding, which is quite high for Norway, drought, epidemics, conflicts that are presently ongoing and their impact to Norway, potential impact, so probabilities, and also what they project for future conflicts. And then they look at the change of the climate risks, what they expect by 2050 and by 2080. They assess the current risks based on, again, the hazard plus exposure, vulnerabilities, and coping mechanisms. And then they divide each of those categories, break them down even more. So under coping capacity, like they look at the governance of the country, communication systems, media. Do the population get real factual information or is there misinformation? They look at the physical health of the population. They look at access to health care, which is a really big one, right? So free health care, I mean, they rank really highly on these issues. They look at the different dimensions of vulnerability within the human society. So inequality, are there very, very wealthy people? So economic disparity among wealth within the country, which leads to unrest. How many children are under 5? There's about a dozen other factors. How much food security is there, et cetera. And then they have the same sort of thing for governance. They break that down into about 10 different things: government efficiency, government truthfulness, political stability, instability. So all those factors are weighted and then they come up with an overall number. It's not just the climate risks that you're exposed to, but it's how capable the country is of dealing with it that ranks, for example, the Scandinavian countries in the top 10 and African countries in the bottom quarter, if you like. So it's very interesting. I think it's very, very good information. Canada is ranked 25th from the top, I believe. The US is up high, but the US is dropping quickly because of all the government issues and factors and not full
Yeah.
access to healthcare, et cetera. So it's an interesting way to look at it.
Thanks, Paul. So my question to you before we turn to Peter is, I think most people who pay attention to which countries seem to be thriving and which ones not would probably shrug their shoulders and say, well, of course, the countries in Scandinavia and Northern Europe and a couple other countries like New Zealand, Australia, et cetera, they're going to rank the highest because they're the wealthiest, they're the most politically stable and so forth. So, I mean, what are we really learning from this that we don't already know?
Well, what's interesting is you now have data to look at your own country. If you're thinking of moving somewhere else in the world for a job or whatever, you could actually take climate risks into consideration using these sort of tools. So I think it's useful for that sort of thing. But again, Norway being number one is all fine and dandy, but I'm telling you that if the AMOC shuts down, the Scandinavian countries will be hit extremely hard, and you won't want to be in those places because they won't be able to grow their own food at all. They'll be cold year round, right? So there's other factors that come into play which are not being considered in these risk assessments.
That's a really good point, and I want to come back to that, but we'll come back to it a little later because we want to give Peter an opportunity to weigh in. Peter, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I started looking at the vulnerabilities, and but it was a very good thing to go for, which are the least vulnerable, which have done the most. That's very informative. So that's how I started. German Watch. I was sort of surprised to see that they had the United States down there amongst their top vulnerable countries. So that was interesting. Anyway, eventually I thought about it and I decided, we're actually all vulnerable, right? I don't think there's any country that isn't not very vulnerable. In fact, look at the floods that we've had all around the world. Look at the fires that we've had all around the world. And of course, we know that those are rapidly getting worse. The old idea was that there were winners and losers, right? Countries in the northern hemisphere would be winners and the poor people in the tropics would be losers. Well, it's not like that anymore. We're all vulnerable, and we're all vulnerable for a number of the reasons are in the science. However, the other thing which I have found very distressing is that there's no sense of a planetary emergency out there anymore. I don't sense it at all, but I'll get back to that later. So, with respect to where we stand at the science that determines our vulnerability and all our impacts, CO2 equivalent in 2023 was 534 parts per million. So that's all the greenhouse gases rolled together. That is extremely high, especially considering that decades ago, the magic number for CO2 equivalent to avoid 2 degrees C equilibrium was 450 parts per million. And hence, of course, Hansen followed that with his 350. We also have other things happening which make all of us more vulnerable. For example, we have the land carbon sink, and according to NOAA, the ocean carbon sink weakening. So that's a process that's now ongoing, and it's going to make everything worse. As I keep on saying, emissions had to be in decline according to the IPCC assessment by 2025. We're in 2025, and our emissions are still being increased. I was surprised to see in the media that in the first quarter, I wasn't surprised that United States emissions were reported going up, but there was a report that EU emissions are going up. So, with respect to emissions, we are all extremely, horribly vulnerable. There's another thing that's making us a new thing that everybody's interested in, which is making us all very vulnerable, and that's AI. As usual, the International Energy Agency put an excellent report out on that. And the increase in the electricity use, of course, was pretty stunning. Now, the other thing, which is very, very obvious and often repeated, but we've got another COP coming up at the end of this year. It is COP 30. We've had no progress in 30 years, right? None whatsoever. All that's happened in the past 30 years is emissions have increased. Overall, they've increased at a very steady, rapid rate, the linear increases, very, very rapid.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate those comments. As I was thinking about this important topic, and I remember when I checked back to see what I actually wrote about it in my book, and when I talked about vulnerability of different nations, I put it under the climate term of climate triage, because in some respects, what these indices are used for to some degree, and may be used even more in the future, is as a basis for doling out financial aid and investment and attempting to equalize and to be used in the, at every COP when the perennial arguments that rarely get resolved about what are the responsibilities of the developed nations towards the undeveloped nations and towards the most vulnerable, because we are in a situation of climate triage. of basically making collectively, the 8 billion of us, making very difficult decisions about who gets to live and who gets to die, to put it most bluntly. One more thing I want to say, and then I'll turn it back to Paul, and that is, I went to look at what I wrote a couple of years ago, and I said, if there was a decision to try to salvage or support or save financially and otherwise, let's say the low-lying nation states in the Pacific that may literally disappear in decades because of sea level rise, or to address a country like Pakistan, which has extreme distress, extreme climate vulnerability, and is also has nuclear weapons, which takes precedence. In an ideal world, neither would take precedence. There'd be enough to support every country, but that's not the world we live in. And so, with that, let me turn it back to Paul.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to make a distinction between a country being at risk to climate change and people within that country, because it's a very regional thing within countries. We're talking, those are two different things. Like if you live on a coastline in a country that's supposed to be at low risk to climate and there's sea level rise and storm surge, et cetera, you get hit. If you're on a river and the remnants of a hurricane come through, you get devastated. Just think of some of the regions in the US with these tropical storms moving far inland, causing massive flooding. So, it's important that people look for what particular hazards are in their regions where they are, because those are quite different from risks to the country. I think the risks to the country are more, if the country's financial state is uncertain, if they're in great debt, if they have an unstable government, climate change could finish off that government and then risk the entire country. So those are two different things. Some of the things, I mean, the World Economic Forum, they say by 2050, we'll have 14.5 million deaths from climate change. The global economic cost will be $12.5 trillion. There was a report recently that said the US damages are approaching $1 trillion already. The WEF says that 132 million people will probably be driven into poverty by 2030, which is only 5 years out. So the risks are very uneven, not just amongst countries, but amongst populations within countries. So some other things that they say in sort of highlights of this Columbia Climate School report and risk index, which the article was just from June. So this is a new index. This is a new project from Columbia, although it does cover the years 2010 onwards in terms of risks. They say a quarter of the world's population is in the red zone, which is the highest risk. Like it's in the top half of climate risk and the top half of financial vulnerability. They say that more and more people are getting put into these regions. It's 1/3 of the nations roughly that they looked at. They looked at 188 countries, at 65 countries. Most of the countries are in low to mid income, according to the OECD financial economic summaries on these countries. There are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there's 1.2 billion people. Of those 65 countries, 43 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. Population's expected to double there by 2070. Many of these countries are already in debt and suffering. There's countries in Asia which are on the red zone list, including that covers about 500 million people, countries that are low-lying like Bangladesh, Kiribati, Myanmar, Pakistan's in there, Sri Lanka, right? Latin America, there's some countries there that many of those are, the risks are different depending on where you are. I think the risks there are often tropical storms. There are a couple European countries in the red zone list, including Ukraine and Cyprus, for various reasons. And then I've already talked about some of the countries on the other side of the spectrum, like the Scandinavian countries and so on. So anyway, it's an interesting dashboard. I highly recommend that you have a look at it. Look at your own country, look at other countries nearby you, and you can see how they're coming up with their risk, because they look at a lot of different factors. And these would be risks that would be applicable to any disaster hitting the country, like pandemics, earthquakes, other things. It's not just climate risks.
Well, thanks, Paul. Of course, underlying a lot of what these indices are attempting to do and what we're talking about today is a larger question that we don't have time to get into, and that is to what degree can we attribute, or can scientists attribute these disasters, whether they're floods or fires or droughts or famines, to climate change? And there's rarely a black and white answer to those questions. And those who are on the climate denial end will tend to deny that any of these things are related to climate change. And some people at the other end see everything related to climate change. And I think we can fairly say that almost everything that happens in the way of weather, at least at a large scale, is influenced by climate change. But we're still trying to figure out how much and to what degree we can rely upon that. These are challenging questions that go to the heart of how we live. And with that, let me turn it back to Peter.
Yeah, so that's quite a question on attribution. And of course, it wasn't many years ago that the scientists said, well, and everybody said, well, we can't put one extreme weather event on climate change because that's impossible to do. Luckily, we have an excellent group of scientists now who do the attribution studies, and they are finding that in actual fact, very few of these terrible disasters are not driven or partly driven by climate change. So there's a huge message there. So who's the most vulnerable? So who's really the most vulnerable? So that is the country of tomorrow. That's the most vulnerable country. So all the world's children today are not only most vulnerable, we've gone now from vulnerability to horrifying, terrible impacts. And I think that's predictable by what we're seeing. So all future generations, of course, as well. So what's the purpose of doing these risk and vulnerability studies Herb has mentioned? Well, I think the purpose should be that the wealthy countries should follow what they're obliged and required to do under the 1992 Climate Convention, which is to transfer all kinds of resources, funds, monies, so that the countries that we basically always known are most vulnerable, that they get helped. Now, in actual fact, they get the opposite. Take Pakistan. Pakistan is at number one by a huge margin in the German Watch Vulnerability Index. So you remember the horrific floods, and that was the second time they had horrific floods. They had one back in 2010. And, very, very slowly governments and organizations and IMFs said that, oh, we'll provide this, we'll provide that, the other. Well, they didn't provide them. They were all loans. So Pakistan had its agriculture, a lot of its country trashed. And then because of that, their indebtedness was increased.
Thank you, Peter. What I will remember, I think, most from many of the memorable comments that are made today is the answer to the question that you asked, Peter. You asked the question and you answered it. And that is, what is a country that is most vulnerable? And your answer, correct me if I'm wrong, was the country of tomorrow. And I think that really says so much, because we're talking about these indices are a snapshot, very imperfect snapshot of the situation that countries are in today. In many cases, particularly in the global south, there's not even sufficient data to be able to accurately report on the climate emergency actions that are occurring in those countries and the vulnerabilities. And as Paul pointed out earlier, so you move to Scandinavia, and then the AMOC decides that it wants to collapse. Says, I've had it, guys. I mean, all this fresh water coming in from the Arctic, I just can't make it anymore. Sorry, I'm out of here. And with it goes Europe in particular, in general, and Scandinavia in particular. Not overnight, but pretty damn fast from what scientists are saying. So we're in a world of instability by definition, and all of us need to figure out how to live, whether we're old folks or young folks or people in the middle, live with a world that will be getting less predictable and stable each and every year. So I want to thank Peter and Paul today. And I want to, as I said at the beginning, I want to just take a couple minutes to highlight a few of the many, sort of news headlines that have come out recently that may be of interest to our viewers. And I hope that you'll let us know whether you find this couple of minutes helpful and whether you have any suggestions for news bulletins, if you will, or news events you'd like us to broadcast in our future programs. So, in no particular order of importance, the first one I want to highlight is the fact that there was a major international effort to negotiate a new treaty on plastic pollution. And we have talked about the absolutely frightening consequences of plastic and their linkages to climate change in several of our programs. So they met in Geneva in the middle of August, just a few days ago or so. And the release, and I'll just read a couple of sentences. Delegates discussing the world's first legally binding treaty to tackle plastic pollution failed to reach consensus, diplomats said on Friday, voicing disappointment and even rage that the 10-day talks produced no deal. And basically, the chair of the negotiations adjourned the session with a pledge to resume talks at an undetermined later date, drawing weak applause from exhausted delegates who had worked into the early hours. And it was, as is often the case, a handful of countries in particular, including such countries as Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United States, that seemed to be the most resistant. The U.S. apparently sent a large delegation to make sure there would be little action on curtailing the use of plastics. And we'll all be paying the price for that. So that's number one. Number two is a headline that I saw last week. Extreme heat can raise newborn death risk by 22%. This was in the online publication Vox, VOX. Climate change poses unique threats to some of the most foundational human experiences, giving birth and growing up. That's the conclusion of a recent summary report compiled by researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which shows that climate change is exposing literally tens of millions of women and children to a worsening slate of physical, mental, and social risks, particularly, of course, if they live in the poorest reaches of the globe. Already 1 billion children experience a level of risk that the report characterizes as extreme. So, again, take a deep breath. I don't mean to necessarily, these aren't necessarily even the most depressing bits of news, but it's a sampling of what we're seeing and hearing and reading. And the next one comes, and let me just read a couple of these paragraphs. The residents of Lucia, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name and mangling it because I don't know Spanish, Mexico, knew the heat wave was bad when they heard the thuds. One by one, the town's howler monkeys, overcome with dehydration and exhaustion, were falling from the trees like apples, their limp bodies smacking the ground as temperatures sizzled past 43 degrees C, which is 110 F, in spring last year. Those who survived were given ice and intravenous drips by rescuers. At least 83 of the primates were found dead in the state of Tabasco, though local veterinarians estimated hundreds throughout the region probably perished. Episodes such as this are unfolding across the world as the climate crisis delivers harsher and more frequent heat waves. Flying foxes have tumbled from trees in Australia. Billions of barnacles have baked in tide pools in Canada, and male beetles have been virtually sterilized by soaring temperatures. But of course, the question is then, what are we doing about that? And I will leave you with just a sentence or two that says that there was a report that many of you may know that was commissioned by the current United States government not to see how we can better address climate change, but to justify rolling back climate regulations. And according to a carbon brief, a very well-known online publication, according to a carbon brief fact check, this report contains, quote, at least 100 false or misleading statements, according to dozens of leading climate scientists. So here we are. Today's news, if any of you doubt, and I don't think you would or you wouldn't be watching us, that there is a climate emergency, I think what you've heard earlier today about the most vulnerable countries and what you've just heard now about a few news snippets will disabuse you of the notion that we're in anything but a climate emergency. It's an extreme climate emergency, getting more extreme by the day. We look forward to seeing you next week. As always, we ask that you like this program, that you subscribe to our channel, that you leave us your comments on the program and on the news bits that we presented to you today, that you share this with your friends and colleagues, that you go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org, and that you come back next week for our program again. Thank you so much and take care.